Ravi Zacharias.
Dr. Ravi Zacharias is one of the world's foremost Christian apologists. He equips Christians to defend their faith and has debated some of the world's most well-known spiritual skeptics. A visiting professor at Wycliffe Hall of Oxford, where he teaches apologetics and evangelism, he has also lectured at prestigious universities such as Harvard, Princeton, and Oxford. A radio host and prolific author, Dr. Zacharias has more than 20 books to his credit. But it was his own biography, Walking from East to West, that held some of the most surprising revelations, including his painful struggles in school, his furiously strict father, and a teenage suicide attempt. He was in Toronto recently, and I had a chance to sit down with him. Dr. Zacharias, you recently wrote your memoirs, Walking from East to West, and it was surprising for me to read about you. You're so known for speaking to intellectuals and debating atheists. You actually didn't do that well in school growing up. Tell me about that.
It's really a very strange journey for me. A lot of it had to do with interest, aptitude, effort. You know, you really put your effort, Cheryl, behind what grabs you, what interests you, and studies never did. And so I was one colossal flop all the way through till my teens when I found the Lord.
You haven't always had such a deep faith in God, even though you did go to church when you were younger. You were an atheist. What happened?
My dad used to take us to church. Service would be over at 9. My cricket matches started at 10 Sunday morning. That's all I lived for, the cricket pitch, the cricket field. That's what it was. It was God had been marginalized. Oh yeah, examination time and all. If you're up there, please help me. I need you type thing. But then, you know, I lived in India, born and raised there, and pressure to perform and studies is number one in India. You don't just pass. You better pass right at the top or you're in trouble. And I was in trouble. And I knew I wasn't going to make it. The maximum number of suicides in India happen every year after the examinations because people don't see a future if they haven't performed well. Well, I was one of those statistics. I'd attempted to take my own life, and I was in a hospital room. And somebody brought me a Bible. That was the last thing I expected to see. And yet, through the reading of the scriptures there, and the passage was read to me from John chapter 14, Jesus saying to Thomas in a conversation, because I live, you also shall live. So there I was at the age of 17 saying, Jesus, if you are who you claim to be, take control of my life. I don't know how to live. I don't even know if I want to live, but I want life. I don't have it now. If you will take charge of my life and give me what I need, I will leave no stone unturned in my pursuit of truth. That's what happened. Atheism is a strong word. I would say I lived as if I was an atheist.
Well, you are so known for defending our faith and debating with atheists. A lot of Christians are so grateful that you fulfill that role for us. But many of them think, well, but that's not my calling, or that's not really my strength. Are we all supposed to be able to defend our faith?
We are all apologists, whether we realize it or not. The only question is whether we're good or bad apologists. And those are not my words, that's C.S. Lewis's. But that does not mean apologetics, which is the discipline of the defense of the Christian faith in the academy. The apologetics of touch is equally important, caring for the needy, having compassion for the poor. That is an apologia. That is an apologetic. You know, people will look at that life and say, why is this person doing this for me? The apologetics of relationships, where you befriend somebody. If you meet, for example, people in the Islamic world, most of those who have come to Christ from that part of the world will tell you it was either a dream that God spoke to them or the love of Christ that they saw in somebody else. So we're all apologists. However, I think we should all work at one thing that we don't often work at. Even if we don't have the answers to people's questions, we should at least know where the resources are. You know, I can say, for example, look, I'm not big into science, but I know exactly where you need to go to pick up a book and what website you need to get onto where the answers are there.
You know, there's a portion of Christianity that says you need to be able to defend the faith and study and be educated. There's another part that says really Christianity is more experiential than it is a discipline of the mind. Which is it, or is it both? Are they in competition?
Absolutely, Cheryl. It is both. And if you miss either one of them, I think you shortchange yourself. You know, I think it was Archbishop William Temple who said the longest journey in life is between the head and the heart. And if you don't allow it to filter down, it becomes a cerebrally driven thing. I have seen Christian philosophers and apologists whose life I would not want to emulate, whose personality didn't touch me, whose intellect did. On the other hand, I found people of tremendous devotional strength, but who really don't think things through when the questioner or the skeptic comes to ask them. This is the balance. It is the indispensable balance. And if you don't connect the two, you actually, that which God had joined together, we have put asunder.
You know, when you're talking about speaking to this generation, you are speaking to a postmodern world. A lot of people in the church are very negative about postmodernism. Is it inherently evil?
Postmodernism is a mood much more than it is a kind of an organized movement. Postmodernism was at the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve said, "Has God really said?" What did postmodernism do? It questioned propositional truth. Does a statement really mean what it says, or do you fuse your own meaning into any statement? So postmodernism questioned verbal authority. That's where it all began. You don't leave the authority with the author, the authority goes to the reader. So you can read a book and you become sovereign over the author. Postmodernism is a mixed bag. There are some very dangerous elements to it where absolute truth became conditioned and relativism took hold, but you really don't want a relativist in the lab. You don't want a relativist for a pilot. You know, you don't want to say, I know that's what the tower is saying, and I know this what the instruments are saying, but I'm going to fuse my own meaning into these readings. So life cannot be lived on the postmodern cutting edge. One thing postmodernism has done, which is constructive, it has a hunger for community. And that's where I think the church should rise.
Well, when you're talking about absolutes, the Bible is a very absolute kind of book.
Mm-hmm.
How do you communicate, Christian absolutes to a culture that kind of resists that idea?
And what happened when Adam and Eve were challenged with God's laws? The interesting thing is this: there was only one prohibition, only one. In the day that you eat of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, you shall surely die. And we were told not to eat of that, because in the day we would eat of that, we would be as God, knowing good and evil. What it really meant was we would redefine good and evil. You and I don't have the right to do that. The moment you and I redefine good and evil and we come up with two different definitions, whose good is going to trump the other person's good? That's exactly what has happened in our culture today. We make decisions ad hoc, whether it's on taxes, whether we cheat or not, whether it's on marriages, whether it's in relationships, whether it's in the job or whatever, and we go through different arenas, Cheryl, every day, each with its different ethos. And the collapse of our culture today symptomatically is in economics, but actually is in morality. That's where it all began. I said to a New York Times person who was interviewing me, I said, why are we all so shocked? We taught them in our Ivy League schools that ethics is all relative. And then when they became the head of Enron and acted as relativists, we put them in jail. What has happened? Money has no point of reference anymore. People borrowed without the ability to repay. In my wallet, I carry a $100 million bill. It's an authentic bill, but it's from Zimbabwe, where there is nothing worth anything.
I was going to say, wow, hand over your wallet.
Exactly, exactly. This is the point. But what's it worth? It's what's happened with morality. If you and I don't have something by which to measure it, it's really not worth anything. It's something we conjure up.
So how do we then communicate this to our culture? Because it's like we're speaking one language and they're speaking another. Is it impossible?
No, I think we have to communicate it in multiple ways. First of all, you have to communicate it by a life that is properly lived. The best way to see a counterfeit is to bring the genuine. And I'll tell you what, when a family is living properly, those whose lives have fallen apart will look at that family with a tremendous sense of admiration, if not envy, and say that's where we need to be as well. So I think the first thing is it needs to be lived out. The second thing is we need to find ways of communicating it without being preachy. If you come down as a 1, 2, 3, Anybody knows as a parent, sounds very good, but they walk out of there saying, boy, I'm glad that one's over with. You have to make it incidental to what they are already doing. I think literature, drama, story, music, illustration, all of these play a point. For preaching, there has to be a three-tiered delivery: argument, story, application. If you don't have the argument, the story will have limited strength. If you do have the argument but not the story, it'll be very dry. If you have the first two but never teach them how to apply it, it all becomes just a great thing to have gone into for some time, but it made no difference.
And humility must play a role in that as well, because even though as Christians we do have absolutes, we don't always live up to our own standards. And doesn't there have to be some kind of recognition in that discussion then that, look, I can't do it every day either, and I fall short many times?
Humility and the way God does not humiliate us, but keeps us humble. And I think that's important. And recognizing our own shortfall. This, I think, is the beauty of the gospel, Cheryl. I was telling the story yesterday of a young woman whose life had fallen apart when her husband committed suicide because she had broken her vows and got into another relationship. And she lived and lived and lived with this haunting specter of his death literally on her lap. He had taken an overdose of a poison and took his life. This was in India when I was visiting, writing my book, Has Christianity Failed You? And she didn't know what to do with this. And she struggled and struggled and finally went and met a Hindu priest or a guru or someone, and he couldn't shake it off her, I guess, and then did this amazing thing. Give me your astrological chart and your birth date and all of this and your husband's, and looked at it all and said, I have come to the conclusion that in your previous life when you were a little girl, he raped you, and this was his karmic payback time that you were involved in. And this professional woman sitting across the table is looking at me, telling me this story, having bought into it. What did that tell me? It told me she desperately needed a way to alleviate her guilt and needed some authority figure to give her the legitimacy of a guilt gone. We all stumble and fall, and we don't know where to go. We cannot minimize it, and yet we cannot run from it. The cross of Jesus Christ is the central message of the gospel, where the price was very seriously paid. And when that price is understood and you respond with love and gratitude, life is very different. And even if you stumble, you don't go like this. You climb higher and higher and get closer and closer to be conformed to the image of God's Son.
So one of the problems with people who don't believe in God is the guilt issue. But also you say one of your problems with atheism is the fact that without a God or some form of higher being in the world, life has no meaning. Why is that a problem for us?
This is actually an amazing question when you unpack it a bit. The question I'm asked most on the campus? They will agree that there is a moral framework somehow we cannot run from. They will grant you that. Even an atheist will say, why can't I be good? I said, I never said you can't be good. I said, but you're begging the question, what is good? And I said, there's a second question you have not even asked, which is implicit in your question, that every time we raise the problem of evil, it is either raised by a person or about persons. It is either raised by a person or about persons. How could God allow the Holocaust? How could this happen? How could God allow a little baby to die in the mother's arms? It's always raised by a person, about a person, which means personhood is indispensable to the question. Therefore, the assumption is that the intrinsic value is not in the question, but in the personhood. How can a person be of intrinsic value if time plus matter plus chance has been the cause of that person? It's nothing more than chemistry in motion. The only way the person can be of value is if the person is the creation of somebody with infinite and intrinsic worth, which means it's God himself that needs to be able to justify our question. So when we talk about evil and all the relativism and all of that, we need to realize that we are the point of God's creation. This is not to build pride. This is to build worth. This is to build value. So as Christians and as believers, when atheists raise the questions and present challenges to us, we need to realize they're actually arguing against themselves. They're assuming their questions are important, their questions are worth it, that they are worth it, and the one they're raising to is worth it, none of which actually holds if we are the product of primordial slime. So the atheist raising the questions ultimately actually argues more for the existence than the non-existence of God.
I think it's an interesting question, because even Christians sometimes struggle with this when something terrible happens to us who've been trying to do good and live good. And it just doesn't seem fair. How do you stay connected and intimate and close to God when it feels like He's hurting you, or He's allowing you to be hurt, or however you frame that with your theology? How do you keep that connection?
You know, with the first temptation to Jesus was, turn these stones into bread and they will follow you. Not true. It's absolutely not true. Take a look at us in the West here. Take a look at the East. Here we are in Canada and North America, amongst the wealthiest continent in the world. Look at the irreligion we have here. Look at the blatant atheism we have here, the blatant repudiation of God. You go to a land like India, which for decades has lived with so much deprivation, and the greatest amount of the hunger for spiritual truth is in that country. So prosperity does not necessarily beget spirituality. Prosperity, in fact, can oftentimes beget this kind of autonomy and a sense of self, we're self-made people. So when we do go through a trying time, it may be God's megaphone. I have had more people come to Him in times of need than when they are riding the crest of success. Some of the greatest saints have been those who have lived with the greatest amount of hurt. One of my great heroes in the early days of my studies was the famed writer Annie Johnston Flint, great hymn writer. Annie Johnston became an orphan when she was quite young, raised by the Flint family then, and then contracted cancer and had rheumatoid arthritis and even became blind. And her book is called The Making of the Beautiful. She spent decades in bed. And one of her hymns said, He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength when the labors increase. To added affliction He addeth His mercy. To multiplied trials His multiplied peace. When we have exhausted our store of endurance, when our strength has failed ere the day is half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving has only begun. His love has no limit, His grace has no measure, His power has no boundaries known unto men, for out of His infinite riches in Jesus He giveth and giveth and giveth again. Some of the greatest saints have suffered some of the greatest hurts and come out with some of the greatest comfort. It is God's extraordinary way to bring us to the mountaintop after the valley.
I think that's a wonderful positive note to end on. So thank you so much for your time. I know you're so busy. I really appreciate it.
Good to be with you, Cheryl. Thank you.